It was an extraordinary Barcelona. Everything had changed. You couldn't tell Barcelona was at war, but you could tell there was a revolution going on. And there were far more flags and many people in the streets calling for volunteers, and many lorries leaving for the front, and many songs. There had never been so much singing.
The people of Barcelona celebrated. Within days of the army rising, revolution had burst out spontaneously in most of Republican Spain. The Republican government was helpless. Later, government and revolution would come into confrontation, a confrontation that would help to seal the fate of the Republic. From Madrid and other Republican cities, columns of workers' militia set out to fight the army rebels. In these first weeks of the Civil War, the militias were the only real defense of the Republic. They were young, enthusiastic, recklessly confident. But the columns had been thrown together in haste. Worse, each column was linked to one of the different parties or trade unions. There was no coordination, no central command. At first, socialists and communists, anarchists and moderate republicans marched together. Later, their deep disagreements about war and revolution were to threaten the fighting power and the very existence of the Republic. But now in July 1936, the ecstasy and hope of revolution dominated men and women. Everything had changed, even in the bullring. The matadors put away their brilliant uniforms, and in street clothes raised the clenched fist. Catalonia was the anarchist stronghold. Here the revolution was more profound, more extreme. By the end of July, anarchists who had seized weapons to defeat the rising dominated the city of Barcelona. It was a moment anarchist militants like Josep Costa had been waiting for.
Però en aquells moments, quan se produeix el trencament, quan la societat rebenta,
at that moment, when society burst wide open, there was such tremendous enthusiasm among the working class, and this was channeled through the unions, the parties, everywhere.
Els partits polítics, a tots els llocs on la gent concorria, amb un entusiasme.
People participated with such enthusiasm, with such vitality, that it's very difficult to describe it now after so many years and to examine that situation coldly. But I do have to say that among ourselves, many of us said, now's the time to destroy all that has been oppressing us.
The Catalan government ruled only in name. All structures of power collapsed. Churches and monasteries were burned and looted. Helpless, the Catalan government offered power to the anarchists. But true to their principles, they refused it. The anarchists believed that out of this revolutionary explosion, the people would create their own free society, without state, church or capitalism. Federico Monsigny was a famous anarchist orator.
Had we taken power because we were the majority, it would have meant betraying a pact of common struggle we had, in a way, sealed with the blood of so many of our men from many different sides. Communists, socialists, syndicalists, and above all, anarchists.
Comunistas, socialistas, sindicalistas, rabasayes y sobre todo anarquistas.
It would have meant betraying that pact and doing in Catalonia what Lenin and Trotsky had done in the Soviet Union with the takeover of power by the Bolsheviks. We didn't do it, and we have been criticized many times for it. With hindsight, who knows, perhaps we should have done it.
Some anarchists now feel that their refusal to take power was the beginning of their undoing. At that time, the anarchists had no doubt about their main objective, to defeat fascism. But for them, the campaign was not just against the army rebels, but against capitalism itself. While the columns surged out to defeat the enemy, committees of workers in the town struggled to construct a new order out of the confusion.
At that time, it seemed impossible to solve those initial difficulties, but looking back, people really showed a lot of common sense. Everything was improvised. You could call it a miracle. Despite the religious meaning of the word, it was a miracle achieved by the ordinary people.
As the chaos subsided, this new revolutionary society began to function. Much of the Catalan economy was now being run by the workers themselves. In Barcelona, trams and cinemas, factories, department stores and even greyhound tracks were run by their own employees. The trade unions saw to food supplies. Union lorries drove out to the villages with goods to exchange for food. Barter, not purchasing, kept Barcelona fed for the first weeks of the Civil War. In some places, money itself, seen by anarchists as inherently evil, was abolished. Shopping was done with vouchers, issued by local committees.
What do these vouchers represent? Well, they had to represent hours of production. The hours spent by a carpenter building a piece of furniture, or the hours spent by a peasant harvesting, working on the fields. Everything was calculated in hours of production. The peasants liked it because it meant making them equal to the industrial workers, making all work equal.
Vouchers bought bread at the bakers. But they now also bought lunch at the Barcelona Ritz. The big hotels have been turned into hospitals, or into canteens serving cheap meals to militiamen and working-class families, as this anarchist newsreel proclaimed.
En sus grandes cocinas se prepara la comida para cuantos van al hotel a saciar su apetito. Los amplios comedores que antes ocupaban maquilladas y frívolas damiselas, grandes financieros, capitanes de industria, aristócratas ociosos y aventureros internacionales de toda la Haya, ahora están abarrotados de hombres y mujeres humildes que siguen el ritmo de la sociedad que se está creando. Barcelona trabaja y come, esa es su fuerza y su virtud.
Now that the factories and workplaces were in the hands of the workers, anarchist union leaders like Josep Costa fought to start production again.
We told the workers to get back to the factory and wait for our instructions. Immediately we called all the factory owners and executives to a meeting at the town hall. We tell them, well, gentlemen, something big has happened here. We don't know what's going to happen, but the factories have to continue functioning. We ask you to be at work again tomorrow at whatever hour you're supposed to start. 5 o'clock or 8 o'clock. Agreed? Agreed. But we have to warn you, labor relations will be very different from now on.
The CNT, the anarchist trade union, had been taken by surprise when the revolution began. It was anarchist militants who rallied the workers to take over their industries. Where the old bosses remained, they had to take orders from these workers' committees. Nearly 2,000 enterprises were collectivized in Catalonia, the greatest experiment in workers' self-management Western Europe has ever seen. The workers now set about improving their working conditions. Free medical care and adequate pensions were introduced. But at the same time, some of the old employers were hounded as enemies of the people.
6 days after it started, around July the 25th, 10 or 11 industrialists were killed in Terrassa. They were murdered. The Catalan bourgeoisie was seized by this general panic. Everybody thought his head was going to be chopped off any minute. I told my father that we should leave. We still had time to leave because everything was so chaotic. But he said, if God wants me to be killed, they can kill me. But I'm staying.
Revolutionary terror spread through the Republican areas. The middle classes in most of Spain had supported the army rebellion, and the liberal Catalan middle classes had remained largely pro-Republican. Now they became the victims of this terror and turned against the Republic.
I didn't belong to this side. I wasn't an anarchist. I wasn't a communist. I was a liberal man who respected other people's way of thinking. And on the other hand, I could never have fought on Franco's side, which was, and still is, totally opposed to my way of thinking.
For the moderate Republican government, the revolution was threatening to split society. It also threatened its chances of winning the war. The Spanish communists took the same view. But it was not only the killings and the collectives that shocked the middle class. The revolution had destroyed a traditional way of life. The power of the church and its moral code disintegrated. For many women on the Republican side, it was a time of astonishing liberation.
That revolutionary explosion gave us women absolute freedom. We couldn't live war as men were living it. For men, things hadn't changed all that much. Our lives, however, had really changed. Women took men's places not only in factories, not only as a workforce, not only in the war industry. It was all women. At that time, to be a woman and to be young was the ultimate.
The revolution brought women instant and radical changes. Abortion was soon made available on demand. Initially, women went to the front to fight and die in the trenches. For Spanish feminists, prostitution was a relic of capitalist exploitation, to be abolished. They set up schools to re-educate prostitutes. Revolutionary vice squads cleaned up the red light district of Barcelona. But it wasn't easy to change old habits overnight.
At the union there were arguments. We've heard that you shut the brothels. Where will people go now? The others would reply, they can find a girlfriend or get married. That can't be done overnight, they'd say. You could have shut 2 brothels today, another 2 tomorrow, so that people could get used to the idea. The same with the taverns. What about the waiters? What will they do for a living? Teach them another trade. Where? You see, there were those we call the pragmatists, the realists who could see the revolution wasn't easy. But then there were the moralists, those who gave the Spanish Revolution the healthy air it had.
Anarchists disapproved of marriage, believing that couples should unite or part freely, without any license from church or state. Young revolutionaries happily adopted their advice, but many mothers were appalled by free love.
Some mothers even came to the union to speak with people they considered apostles of free love. Look, my daughter has left home without telling me. She's living somewhere with someone. We'd say, we're all in favor of it. Yes, but that boy will leave, and we don't even know his name. Well, anyway, the union decided this had to be legalized somehow. So they invented what they called revolutionary weddings.
Revolutionary weddings took many different forms. This is what happened in the Barcelona Woodworkers Union.
We made 3 copies of the marriage certificate, the original and 2 more. The union kept the original, and 1 copy each was given to the man and the woman, who were told, if at any time you have any problems and wish to separate, come here with both pieces of paper. We'll take our copy and set fire to the 3 of them, and you'll be free again. That was the official wedding ceremony. But as with many other things, it became necessary to force the situation a bit, because there wasn't enough time for persuasion and proper education. So the president of the union, a very amusing man from Seville, would take the man aside after the ceremony and tell him, look, what we said about burning the documents isn't quite as easy as you think. It's something that has to be thought about carefully and properly weighed up. So don't come here pestering me, because if you do, I'll give you such a kick in the balls, you'll remember it for the rest of your days, right? So off you go, be happy, long live the revolution.
These revolutionary changes were taking place throughout Republican Spain. Led by improvised military commanders like Buenaventura Durruti, the militia columns pushed their way towards the front. Young laborers rushed to join the militia. As the columns advanced, they spread the revolution. The ancient dream of a collective society without profit or property was made reality in the villages of Aragon. In many places, money itself was abolished. All forms of production were owned by the community, run by their workers. These collectives formed an independent anarchist area within the Republic. The Council of Aragon coordinated their activities. Mas de las Matas was one of the many Aragonese villages collectivized in the summer of 1936. For the villagers, the experience has now become a well-remembered legend. These 3 men were among the young local anarchists who abolished private property in Mas de las Matas. Benigno Castañer was a carpenter.
We built a sufficiently large workshop on the outskirts of the village, and all the carpenters went to work there. They appointed a delegate to represent them at the collectivization committee. The same was done for the bricklayers, the barbers, the blacksmiths, for every trade. The tailors also.
Well, all the barbers had joined the collective voluntarily. They were all in it voluntarily, weren't they? A large shop was found for them, and the 3 or 4 barbers in the village all brought along their tools and their chairs, and they all worked there for free.
And most of their work was done when the peasants came back from the fields in the evening. This also caused some problems, because some people would say, "Look at those lazy barbers. They spend the whole day walking around doing nothing." So we had to explain to everybody that they worked until 10 p.m. so that everybody could be served. Some people just didn't realize how late the barbers had to work. Well, this is one of those minor inconveniences.
The anarchists forced all known right-wingers in the village to join the collective as well. The upheaval of revolution led to terrorism and repression. In Aragon, as in Catalonia, armed gangs drove around killing the better off, the right-wingers, and the followers of the church. In Mas de las Matas, although the local committee tried to prevent it, 6 right-wingers were murdered just outside the village. Here, the only people allowed to keep their property were those left-wingers who were not anarchists. For the rest, members of the collective by choice or out of fear. The old world of cash and property, rich and poor, now disappeared.
Money was abolished, and we created what we called the family card, with all the members of the family, and everything that wasn't produced here was allotted according to the numbers in each family. For example, sugar, rice, even meat, 100 grams per person per day. And it was the same for everybody. There were no preferences. Everybody ate as much as they wanted of the local produce. So money for use in the village was completely abolished.
The first problem was that because everything was free, coffee, tobacco, this was a problem. Everything was free, so everybody wanted to drink coffee, everybody wanted to smoke, and so on. So this is something that had to be corrected, and that's when we started rationing cigarettes.
No, tobacco was rationed, but we never denied anybody his cigarettes. This was a contradiction for us because we were against all vices, and yet we were well aware that by handing out free cigarettes we encouraged people to smoke, but we couldn't deny them to anybody.
For the anarchist peasants in Mas de las Matas and in other villages, collectivization brought instant benefits. The profit motive had disappeared. Everyone now worked only for the community.
I joined the collective fully convinced, and I gave everything. At home they were nearly crying because I took everything to the collective. Our sheep, all our money, everything. And with such enthusiasm. And working as much as we did before because the harvest had been delayed. We worked day and night.
In this summer of 1936, the revolution was triumphing in most of Republican Spain. But it was already failing in its most basic task, to win the war. Everywhere the militias were being held or defeated by the advancing rebel armies. In this crisis, the Republic was divided. For some, the government and the communists, revolution must wait until the war was won. For the anarchists and many socialists, the only way to win the war was to defend and extend the revolution. This argument was soon to tear apart and transform the Republic, unleashing a civil war within the Civil War. In central and northern Spain, the army rebels were winning the war. General Franco soon became the absolute political and military ruler of the nationalist side as his regular soldiers captured town after town. The militia columns brave but disorganized, had no unified command. The revolution had left the Republican government helpless, and yet initially the new revolutionary leaders did not form a new central government or military command of their own. Two months after the start of the war, Franco's troops were approaching Madrid. Now, at last, with the Republic on the brink of defeat, the politicians in Madrid took action. In September 1936, the Socialist Union leader Francisco Largo Caballero formed a so-called Government of Victory, with socialist and communist ministers. A strong military command was formed. Further revolution was discouraged. The anarchist revolution still controlled much of Catalonia and Aragon. The anarchist leaders refused on principle to join the new central government. But this Government of Victory was going to centralize political decision-making and leave the anarchists out in the cold. The new Madrid government was a triumph for the rapidly expanding Communist Party. In line with Stalin's policy, they stood for an anti-fascist popular front, an alliance of left-wing and middle-class parties which would appear moderate and responsible enough to win support from Western democracies. They also wanted to check the revolution and impose their discipline.
Aparecía claro que entrábamos en una guerra civil.
It was clear that we were entering a civil war and that we were facing an organized enemy with an organized army, and that we needed a real army ourselves. And the starting point for this army was the 5th Regiment.
The discipline of the 5th Regiment was powerful propaganda for the communist approach to the war. The communists, helping to build a new popular army, believed in the values of obedience, rank, authority. Their old rivals, the anarchists, were anti-militarist, opposed on principle to hierarchical discipline. For them, war, like revolution, must be made through popular initiative.
I have always believed that the day they started to militarize the people, the day that the spontaneous nature of popular combat was destroyed, we started to lose the war. And this is something the communists have always refused to accept.
But all styles of war need weapons, and the Soviet Union soon became the only country prepared to supply them in large quantities. This in turn increased the influence of the Spanish communists. A minority party when the Civil War began, they were now becoming the strongest political force in the Republic. Soviet military aid arrived just in time to help defend the Spanish capital. No pasarán. They shall not pass. By November, Franco's troops had encircled Madrid on 3 sides. When the final attack came, the people of Madrid fought shoulder to shoulder with loyal officers and with the Republican militias who had been retreating for the past 4 months. The attack on Madrid was beaten back. The defense of Madrid became a legend, and it gave the Republic fresh hope for victory. The anarchist military commander Durruti died in the battle for Madrid. His funeral in Barcelona became an immense anarchist show of faith. But the movement was already beginning to split under the pressure of its own internal contradictions. With the enemy at the gates of Madrid, the anarchist leaders had shelved their principles and joined the government. 4 anarchists became ministers in the central government. Others had already joined the Catalan regional government. Their followers were shocked and confused. Moreover, in Catalonia, the anarchist heartland, anarchist collectivization was being checked. The regional government was asserting control of the industries which anarchists had collectivized. Josep Tarradellas was the Catalan finance councillor.
I was the first councillor and finance councillor of the regional government, the Generalitat. Therefore, faced with the CNT's refusal to allow control over the collectivized industries, I ordered all the banks not to cash any checks or hand over money to them without my permission. So the workers found themselves in a difficult situation. They would run out of money, and at the bank they would be told, "No, I need the Generalitat's permission." So then they would come to us, and we would say, "No, unless you allow us to control the collective."
As the anarchists weakened, the communists became stronger. The party attracted many who felt threatened by the revolution. Middle-class moderates who admired communist discipline at the front and order and restraint behind the lines. Revolutionary chaos still reigned in much of Republican Spain.
This led to an overwhelming feeling of unease in the country. And as we were in favor of discipline and control, of laying down all the rules necessary for re-establishing the army, the police, the courts of justice, well, obviously, all these things were welcomed by the population.
But the communist methods of recruitment attracted bitter criticism from other parties in the Republic.
El Partido Comunista, a diferencia de otros partidos.
In contrast with the other parties, the Communist Party opened its doors unconditionally and without any controls to anybody who wanted to join. What they wanted was to build up their party by taking advantage of the very special circumstances in Spain at the time. So that's the way they did it. They were very smart about it. It was easy to grow that way. They made the soldier sergeant, the sergeant lieutenant, and the professional man captain. They cultivated people's ambition so that they became unconditional supporters. They made sure that people who had no influence in their civilian lives became important in military terms.
The communists had been forced to change their line. At first, they had opposed the revolution as a threat to the Republic. In March 1937, they admitted that significant revolutionary gains had been made, but any further changes would have to wait. The overriding aim must be to win the war. For the communists, this meant bringing home rule in Catalonia and the Basque Country under central control. One source of friction between the central government and Catalonia was control over the war industry.
The only cartridge factory in our zone was near Toledo, so my trip to Madrid was to ask the central government that because the factory was still in our hands, it should be brought to Catalonia, which was the only place where it could function properly.
Tarradellas' visit to Madrid ended in failure. The government, wary of growing regional power, refused his request.
So I left Madrid without the Toledo factory. A short while later I heard, as did all the other Spaniards, that Toledo had fallen into the hands of General Franco. They chose, in a way, to leave this factory in Franco's hands rather than have it in a place where it could have been useful.
But these squabbles over regional rights were far less ominous than the collision between communists and their political rivals over the whole future of the Republic. At this meeting in March 1937, José Díaz, the Communist General Secretary, asked, "Who are the enemies of the Republic?" He answered himself, "Fascists, uncontrollables, and Trotskyists." He was following Stalin's policy in the Soviet Union. There, the uncontrollables, the anarchists, had already been purged. The Spanish Civil War coincided with the height of Stalin's purges of his political rivals. Leon Trotsky had been exiled in 1929. Bolshevik veterans like Zinoviev and Kamenev, also seen here in 1926 at a state funeral, were executed in 1936. Trotskyist was a label given to any independent Marxist who defied the instructions of Stalin and the Comintern in Moscow. Communists in Western Europe justified these purges. Trotsky was pilloried as a Nazi agent. Bill Bailey was an American communist fighting with the international brigades.
We had heard that Joe Stalin was trying to keep the country secured and safe and get rid of all the enemies that were trying to constantly tear down the Soviet Union. Therefore, he was conducting these type of purges, and we were led to believe that they were enemies of the people, enemies of the Russian people, consequently the enemies of the working class every place. And later on, of course, it proved that he was wrong, that he was nothing but a paranoid, sick SOB in many cases. And these people that were purged came from the background of fighting for the great ideals of socialism. They went through all the aches and pains and the terror to create this society, only to be taken out later as dogs and shot.
The POUM was an independent Spanish Marxist party which loudly attacked Stalin's dictatorship. Following the Moscow line, the Spanish communists called the POUM Trotskyist, which it wasn't, and accused it of collaborating with fascism. Frank Deegan was a Liverpool docker who had volunteered to fight in Spain.
Well, we were informed by our political commissars that our troops who were on the Anarchist front, who were mainly composed of anarchist divisions and members of the POUM, who were commonly known as Trotskyists, were fraternising with the enemy, even playing football matches.
By the 1st of May 1937, the political tension in Barcelona was so acute that the May Day parade had to be cancelled. The anarchists and the POUM were still powerful in the city. The communists were impatient for a showdown, as was the central government, with the exception, of course, of the anarchist ministers. The conflict began here, at the Barcelona telephone exchange, which was still run by anarchists. One of the girls on duty that day was Enriqueta García Tavera.
I was at the switchboard near the window. The anarchist guards were half asleep over their rifles. At about 3 o'clock, I looked out and saw 3 lorry loads of assault guards pull up outside. They jumped out and raced into the building. They started going up the stairs. I think most of the anarchist guards were on the first floor. Then I heard shots, and I was even more frightened.
The anarchists saw this as the all-out challenge they had been expecting. They raised barricades throughout the city. Shooting began in the streets. On the Aragon front, some anarchist units began to march back to Barcelona. The anarchist Juan Manuel Molina was Defense Under-Secretary in Catalonia.
I phoned all the commanders of the divisions at the front and told them to stay put and secure their sectors, that everything was quiet. I told them everything was under control in Barcelona and that we had more than enough men here.
On the Barcelona streets, the anarchists could have used their superior strength before the government reinforcements arrived.
The truth is that in Barcelona we controlled the situation. I hadn't intervened yet. All the military barracks were in my hands, except for the Karl Marx barracks, and we had it surrounded by the people, just waiting for my orders to attack.
The anarchist ministers rushed to Barcelona. One of them, Federica Montseny, appealed to her followers over the radio. She argued that they could not afford a civil war behind the lines.
I tried to make them understand that they couldn't go on fighting, that they had to lay down their weapons and end that fight, that the battlefronts would collapse and it would all end shamefully in front of the whole world. This
appeal horrified the anarchist militants at the barricades. Their leaders, they thought, had betrayed them. To lay down their arms would mean the end of their revolution.
At the barricades, you heard all the insults you can possibly imagine. Old militants were saying that the ministers had forgotten what it was like to be a worker, that the revolution had to be carried out of the barricades and not of the ministers, and they were going to shoot those ministers. There I heard all those threats from people who were disappointed, and they all remembered what had happened to the anarchists under the Bolsheviks in Russia. And they feared the same would happen here, as it did eventually, that they would be victims of the repression of the communists.
The Republic brought in troops to put down the insurrection. 5 days of fighting had left about 500 dead. The anarchist power and their revolutionary vision of the future now lay shattered.
That's where we lost the war, the revolution, and all the hopes that the Spanish people had placed in the transformation. That's where it all ended, in the May events.
The May events also overthrew Largo Caballero, the socialist prime minister of the Republic. He had been too independent, too tolerant for communist taste. Now he was forced out of office and replaced by Juan Negrin, another socialist, but more authoritarian than Largo Caballero. With the anarchist revolution checked in Catalonia, the communists were now free to deal with their other rivals, the POUM, who had fought alongside the anarchists in the May events of Barcelona. In June 1937, POUM was declared illegal, and an order issued for the arrest of its leaders. The first to be taken was Andrés Nin, the POUM's general secretary. Julián Gorquín, another member of the POUM executive, witnessed his arrest.
Another party member, Adroer Rodella, came up to my office to tell me that the police had come to arrest us and take Andrés Nin away. I looked out of the balcony and saw Nin walking outside quite casually, surrounded by policemen. I never would have thought that I would never see him again, and the terrible tragedy that was being prepared for the death of Andrés Nin.
Nin was never seen again. He was apparently taken to this prison in Alcalá de Henares and later murdered by Stalin's agents. Other POUM leaders were later put on trial for treason. The price for halting revolution and restoring order to the Republic was high. Random terror was over, but the communists now controlled much of the political police. This nationalist propaganda film, made at the end of the war, allegedly shows communist torture cells in a Barcelona monastery. Freezing in refrigerators and disorientation techniques were used not only against Franco's agents, but also on the Republic's enemies within its own camp. Aragon was the last area still under anarchist control. In August 1937, the communist military commander Enrique Lista marched in to restore the central government's authority. The communist troops returned land to all those who had been forced to join the anarchist collectives. The central government, with communist support, had demolished the anarchist revolution and imposed its discipline. But at the front, the Republic was failing. Its new disciplined popular army continued to be defeated. Shortly after its takeover of Aragon, the Republican army launched another offensive in an attempt to take pressure off the north. The first major battle was at the small town of Belchite. As so often happened, many Republican soldiers gave their lives to capture a town which was strategically unimportant. It was a battle that American volunteer Bill Bailey will never forget.
What happened was that the fascists were so deeply entrenched that they made every single foot here at a costly expense to us. They were dead. Our dead was every place. Every street had men laying dead in it. Getting inside a house, getting them out of a house, the only way we could do it was punch a hole through the wall, throw a few hand grenades in there, blow that place up, punch the hole again, making it bigger, then go into the house, and by God, we did this hour after hour after hour, until finally we was able to take one entire street. And it was just, you figure that on both sides, our men were doing it on that side, we're doing it on this side, we're taking the floor, we're getting into the basement, and they're resisting every single place. So finally, after, say, 4 or 5 hours, we was able to take one whole street, and that was at a very expensive cost.
Belchite finally fell. But only months later, the Nationalists recaptured it, at very little cost. The Aragon offensive failed. The Republican army was weak on military tactics and had been torn by internal disunity. By the end of 1937, the Republic, its territory shrinking under Franco's onslaught, mounted another offensive. This time the objective was the provincial capital of Teruel. In the bitter cold of the Aragonese winter, Teruel was conquered. Again the Republic had won a bloody victory for an objective of little significance. These victory celebrations in Barcelona were premature.
Veiem el que representa la nostra lluita pels valors universals de la pau, del treball i de la justícia. I anem a la guerra impregnat per aquests sentiments i per a guanyar aquests postulats. Visca la llibertat catalana!
But the brave words of Catalan President Luis Companys could no longer boost Republican morale. In January 1938, Franco's troops counterattacked and reconquered Teruel. Again, an initial Republican success had ended in disaster. The nationalist forces now prepared to push down from Aragon to the Mediterranean. As the Republican troops retreated, thousands of refugees streamed into Catalonia. In Catalonia, the revolutionary battle cries now fell on deaf ears. Only young militants like Teresa Pamias kept their faith in a Republican victory.
Nosaltres teníem una actitud tan entusiasta y tan romàntica que no veiem.
We had such an enthusiastic and romantic attitude that we didn't even notice how ridiculous we looked when we climbed up lampposts to harangue all those poor women and many children queuing up to buy a bit of bread. We would shout from the lampposts that the fascists would not pass, that we would win the war and all lead better and happier lives. This may sound like demagoguery now, but at that time we really felt it.
By February 1938, the nationalist troops were marching towards the sea. The offensive threatened Catalonia, the revolutionary heartland. But there, as in the rest of Republican Spain, the revolutionary spirit of 1936 was now only a memory. On April 14, 1938, nationalist troops reached the Mediterranean, and the Republic was cut in two. As Franco's troops celebrated, the Republic summoned up its remaining energies for a battle to prevent its final collapse. The river Ebro was where the Spanish Republic's fate was to be sealed. July 28, 1938. In the Ebro Valley, the Republic, now close to desperation, launched its greatest offensive. Much of the Republican army was thrown into the battle, a fight not just for ground, but supremely for time. Juan Negrín, the Prime Minister, knew that European war against Hitler was now close. If only the Republic could hang on, it might be rescued by the anti-fascist allies in that war. The Ebro was the most costly battle of the Civil War, but for the Republicans it came at the end of 2 years of bitter, unsuccessful fighting. 2 years which had transformed Republican hopes into memories of failure.
There's a valley in Spain called Jarama. It's a place that we all...
Now failure was behind them. The soldiers of the Republic who crossed the river that day were excited to be on the offensive again.
This was great, that we were crossing the Ebro and going to the other side to have a go at them and push them back. And obviously we were hoping to chase them quite a distance, chase them all together on that front anyway.
This optimism defied the experience of 2 years of defeat. Once again, the Popular Army was attempting to match the enemy in conventional warfare, which would lead to a battle of attrition in which the Republic stood no chance. The attack across the Ebro was probably doomed before it began. The nationalists now held over 2/3 of Spain. They had split the Republican zone into two. Valencia was under threat. The all-out offensive across the Ebro was meant to ward off this danger. The idea came largely from Juan Negrín, the enigmatic Prime Minister of the Republic, a right-wing socialist and a distinguished professor of medicine. Negrín mirrored many of the contradictions of the Republic. He believed that the only way to fight the war was to halt the revolution and bring the army under disciplined, central control, with himself in command. In this, Negrín was closely supported by the communists. They were tough. They took orders ultimately from Moscow. Their vision of democracy was a world away from Negrín's. Yet he was committed to working with the communists, not least because the Republic needed Soviet aid. Negrín was a subtle, unreadable person. No one knew his real mind. At the same moment that he was secretly initiating peace feelers to Franco, he was also organizing the supreme offensive of the war. At first, the nationalists were taken by surprise. The Republican thrust drove them back in hasty retreat. The hills overlooking the small town of Gandesa, 25 miles inside nationalist territory, now became the new front line. General Franco rushed forward reinforcements pulled out of other battlefronts. In huge, prolonged battles like this, Franco's army had the advantage. It was more mobile, and in the nationalist army orders were more efficiently communicated. It benefited from German and Italian aid, while the Republic's foreign aid had diminished with the renewed closure of the French border. Determined not to yield another yard of ground, Franco took personal command. The Ebro attack was halted and turned into 4 months of slogging, static battle, the largest and most savage conflict of the whole war. Hill 666 was one of the Republic's most advanced positions. It became a focus of nationalist counterattacks. Bill Bailey and other international brigaders were helping Spanish Republican troops to defend the hill.
And that was one case where we prayed, literally prayed for the darkness to come so we could at least get up and stretch our legs, move around. And the bastards, when nighttime came, they threw more shells at us. And then it was a question of watching blazing rockets bursting in air after it would hit the mountainside, throw tons of rock at you. And it wasn't so much the artillery hitting you, it was thousands of splinters of rock splashing all over the place. And I have to say that it was one of my most bitter experiences. And I'll speak truthfully and say that there were many times when I figured I would never get off this rock.
In the end, the Republican troops were forced off Hill 666, leaving its slopes littered with their dead. Now began the retreat, a retreat which was only to end with the end of the war. Enrique Lista was a Republican Corps commander at the Battle of the Ebro.
Y nosotros nos encontrábamos en una situación que no podíamos.
We found ourselves in a situation where we couldn't give up any of our positions. So it was a battle of attrition, in which we were losing our best troops, but we had no choice.
By now, there was no choice. Once again, the Popular Army had attempted to match the enemy in regular combat and failed. Just as it had at Brunetti, Belchite, Teruel. The Popular Army found it could not defeat the enemy in conventional fighting for defended positions. The Republic had put down the revolution behind its own lines. This meant that the government also avoided revolutionary military tactics. Guerrilla war, invented in Spain as the people's answer to regular armies, was never seriously attempted in the Civil War. As it had done before, the Popular Army fought with courage. But once again, in a battle of attrition, it could not prevail against the superior weight and professionalism of the nationalists. Once again, the Republican forces were hammered into retreat. Behind them, they left vast quantities of precious equipment. Failure in battle hardened Negrin's resolve to save the Republic. One strategy was negotiation. The previous May, he had published a moderate 13-point declaration for victory. In reality, a hint that the war could be ended by mediation. Horrified by the sum of death and destruction, Negrin nonetheless remained determined that a democratic Spain should emerge from the ruins. His second strategy pursued the same democratic aims. If peace could not be negotiated, he would fight on, in the hope that a greater war between democracy and fascism would explode in Europe, a war which would engulf Spain's own conflict. But Franco would have no compromise. Total victory was within reach. He wanted nothing less. It was an ugly paradox for Negrin, that as he saw it, only Hitler, Franco's ally, could save him. For it was Germany's continued expansionism which he hoped would touch off war in Europe. Then Negrin hoped that Britain and France would welcome the Spanish Republic as an ally. In 1936, Hitler had occupied the Rhineland with troops. In March 1938, the Germans marched into Austria. Now in September 1938, it was Czechoslovakia's turn. At Munich, the statesmen of Britain and France met Hitler and Mussolini to see if the peace could be saved. For the British and French governments, non-intervention in Spain had been one way of trying to postpone a conflict with Hitler. In spite of the blatant foreign aid to both sides in the Civil War, they were still clinging to this policy. Now came the news of the democracy's pact with Hitler. Once again, the Western democracies had chosen the path of appeasement. While Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, told cheering Londoners that it was peace in our time, Negrin faced the truth. Time was against him. When the Second World War came, it was to be too late to save the Spanish Republic. Munich also lost the Republic its only effective ally, Stalin. The Soviet leaders decided to change their whole strategy. Munich destroyed Stalin's policy of building an anti-fascist alliance, in which the Western democracies would stand together with Russia to block the expansion of Germany and Italy. Now Stalin saw himself isolated. To gain time, he was eventually to sign the Nazi-Soviet pact with Hitler. Now, as his anti-fascist alliance plan collapsed, Stalin's support for the Spanish Republic was abandoned. Hitler must not be provoked. Soviet aid to Spain dwindled. Hitler's policy towards Spain changed too, but in the opposite direction. Realizing nothing he did there would cause Britain and France to go to war, he dramatically increased his aid, now keen to end the Spanish War as quickly as possible. There was a huge increase in German military aid to the nationalists. Franco had sent an urgent request for more weapons to clinch the Battle of the Ebro. In return, he agreed to grant Germany generous mining concessions in Spain, and he promised to pay the costs of the German Condor Legion. But Mussolini decided to reduce his aid to Franco. He accepted the proposal of the Non-Intervention Committee to withdraw foreign volunteers fighting in the Civil War. 10,000 Italians, nearly half the total in Spain, now embarked for home. Those who stayed continued fighting with the nationalist army at the Ebro. Negrin also agreed that the foreign volunteers on the Republican side should be withdrawn. He was hoping that non-intervention by foreign powers might at last become a reality. The last grim stages of the Battle of the Ebro were still being fought, when, on October 29th, the International Brigaders took their farewell. people of Barcelona showed their gratitude to these survivors of the 40,000 foreigners who had left their homes to fight for the Spanish Republic. The Passionaria spoke proudly to the crowds. These men reached our country as crusaders for freedom. They gave up everything, their country, home and fortune, fathers, mothers, wives, brothers, sisters and children. And they came and told us, "We are here. Your cause, Spain's cause, is ours. It is the cause of all advanced and progressive mankind." The departure of foreigners hardly affected the Republic's fighting strength. They had mattered in the first days through their discipline and their message of solidarity, but they had not been militarily decisive. By now, the brigades were mostly manned by Spaniards. Most volunteers went home. Only brigaders from fascist countries had no home to go to. But the war went on. By mid-November, Franco had reconquered the ground he had lost to the Republic in the first 2 days of the Ebro offensive. Just before Christmas 1938, the Nationalists crossed the Ebro into Catalonia. The fresh aid from Germany had arrived and was proving decisive. The Nationalist advance was now meeting little resistance. By mid-January 1939, Tarragona had fallen. By the end of January, Franco was nearing Barcelona. The only party utterly united in determination to fight on were the Communists. They used much-needed warplanes to shower leaflets on Barcelona, urging the population to continue the struggle. But Negrín was playing a double game. Outwardly, he went along with the Communists. He had little choice. In secret, he pursued his search for a negotiated peace. But the whole political fabric of the Republic was beginning to fall apart around Negrín. Many resented his apparent sympathy with a hard communist line. The anarchists, whose dreams of revolution were dead, were still fighting, but they were fighting for a republic they didn't believe in. So were the Catalan nationalists, whose treasured autonomy had been eroded by the government's centralist line.
La República ya no era la República.
The Republic was no longer what it had been. The power of the Catalan government had been wiped out by Negrín, to such an extent that at one point I began to ask myself if I was doing the right thing to continue taking part in the fighting at all.
While the communists were trying to boast of public morale, others used their most brutal means to destroy it. For months now, Barcelona had been the target of bombing raids. The previous March, Italian bombers had battered the city in waves that kept coming for 48 hours. The port and the city centre had been particularly badly damaged. The air attacks had continued ever since, but those March raids stayed in Barcelona's memory as the most terrifying.
If I tell you that more than half of Barcelona fled to shelter in the hills and woods around Barcelona, you'll understand what the bombings were like. I was assigned to the casualty post in the Calle Sepulveda, and whenever there was a raid, which was about every 3 hours, we were told where to go to pick up those not seriously wounded. Sometimes, while we were doing this, we were caught by the next bombing, so we had to start all over again. A lot of people from the Red Cross, plus a lot of those whose cars had been commandeered for this, were killed in those attacks.
The bombing of Barcelona came after the air raids on Madrid, Durango and Guernica, but the bombing of Barcelona went on for months. Aimed at cowing the civilian population by its destructive power, it generated a sullen hatred. Since the Republican zone had been cut in two, there were fewer refugees coming into Barcelona. Those who did travelled on north as fast as possible. But they had all told the same story. A story of what took place when the nationalists had captured and occupied their villages and towns. A story of death and persecution. The closer the nationalists got to Barcelona, the more these stories terrified the population. By January 24th, the nationalists were less than 5 miles away.
In Barcelona, people realized that all was lost, in spite of some talk of setting up a line of resistance. No one believed it, because they really just wanted the whole thing to be over. And you'd hear people say, it doesn't matter how it ends, only let it end soon.
I
heard that quite often in my neighborhood. It doesn't matter how it ends, only let it end soon.
The Catalans joined the refugee torrent. Many struggled up the high mountain passes of the Pyrenees. France meant safety. They travelled by day and night. Barcelona, on the morning of January 26th. From all sides, the nationalist forces moved in. The tanks rumbled down the Diagonal. The infantry marched down the slopes above the city. A few communists tried to build barricades. They soon gave up.
Ja baixaven els soldats de l'exèrcit feixista.
The fascist soldiers were already coming down the hillside. It was a very sunny day in Barcelona, one of those very radiant days, and the bayonets of their rifles glinted menacingly in the sunlight. That vision was terrifying, but the truth is that they didn't scare us. But we knew we had to run. We ran and ran as fast as we could. We left the cobblestones by the side of the tram lines.
Of those who stayed, many now welcomed the nationalist columns led by General Yagüe. For them, it was a joyous moment, the hour of rescue, the end of a revolutionary nightmare. Free to practice their religion openly for the first time in nearly 3 years, they praised God and Franco for victory. Some of the Catalan middle class were much less certain. Long tired of the war, they must now have feared the future. Often liberals, they had no sympathy for Franco's regime and knew very well he had none for Catalan autonomy. And the prospect was bleak for communists, anarchists and socialists still in Barcelona. The revenge killings were about to begin. Near the French frontier and the fortress of Figueres, Negrin called a secret meeting of the Cortes. Held at night in the subterranean vaults, this was the last session of the Republican Cortes on Spanish soil. One of the few foreigners present was the British journalist, Willie Forrest.
Well, Negrin got up first to speak and started by reading from a prepared text, but as he proceeded, he sort of threw his script aside and started walking up and down, and some sort of fire came into his voice.
Negrin announced that the 13 points of the government's program were being cut to 3. It was the last point which now mattered most.
Franco must give a guarantee, a cast-iron guarantee, that after the war there would be no reprisals by the victors against the vanquished.
The victors were now sweeping northwards towards the French border. 1 week after Negrin left Figueres, they took the town. They were a mere 20 miles away from the frontier. For the Republicans, it was no longer retreat, but flight. Negrin and his ministers left Spain. After them poured the remnants of the Republican army in Catalonia, packed together with 500,000 refugees. 5,000 human beings crossed the border every hour. On the other side lay only the misery, hunger, and overcrowding of French internment camps. The nationalists reached the last border post and closed it. Catalonia had fallen. For these people, the war was over. But Madrid, and more than a quarter of Spain, was still Republican. Negrin was still Prime Minister. He knew he must go back to Spain to save what could be saved by war or compromise. But Franco had no intention of accepting Negrin's latest peace initiative. He wanted only unconditional surrender. March 1939. Moroccan tribesmen, the Moors, were among the nationalist troops who had been besieging Madrid for over 2 years. The Moorish trenches had become almost a North African village. To the east, they could see the rooftops of Madrid. In the city itself, nationalist supporters have for 2.5 years been trying to live unnoticed. Enrique Meret Magdalena had taken refuge in the Paraguayan embassy.
During those 2 and a bit years, we always spoke in whispers and kept the blinds drawn so nobody would know how many people were inside the one flat. There were between 50 and 60 of us.
For the Madrid population, Republicans and secret nationalists alike, hunger was now the worst torment. Even vegetable roots became a precious form of food. People stood all day in queues, ready to buy anything which arrived in the denuded shops. Hunger and sheer exhaustion of wartime life were sapping the will to fight on. Negrin, the Prime Minister, had flown back to Spain. Surrounding himself by communists whom he promoted to a series of vital military commands, he established himself near Alicante. In what was left of the Republic, there were still 4 armies adding up to 500,000 men. The army commander in Madrid, Colonel Casado, believed that Negrin's reliance on the communists was a major stumbling block to winning peace concessions. He had put out his own peace feelers to the nationalists. Now, to back this, he launched what was in effect a coup d'etat in Madrid. Negrin and his colleagues were at dinner near Alicante when they heard Casado attacking them over the radio. Willie Forrest was there.
There was a telephone in the dining room, and Negrin went over to it and asked to be put through to Casado. He had to hang up for a minute and wait, but then the phone rang. Negrin went over. It was Casado on the line. "What's going on?" was the first words that I heard Negrin say. I couldn't hear, of course, Casado's replies, but from what Negrin said afterwards, it was quite clear, because what Negrin said was, "You've rebelled? Against whom, may I ask? Against me? Then consider yourself relieved of your command." And with that, Negrin slammed down the telephone and, turning to his ministers, he asked them to follow him upstairs for another cabinet meeting.
It was to be a crucial night for Prime Minister Negrin, a night that settled his fate, and the fate of the Republic. Clearly, Negrin's political position was collapsing. The communist leaders decided not to organize resistance to the Casado coup. Whether this reflected Stalin's current disinterest in Spain, and whether this clinched Negrin's decision to flee, remain open questions. At 3 in the morning, Willie Forrest watched as Negrin and his government filed out of their last meeting.
Well, that, as I said, was the end. We who were there didn't need to be told of the government's decision to quit. We saw the ministerial bags being packed. We saw Senor Garces, the police chief, going through his dossiers and tearing up papers. And we knew that Cisneros, the Air Force chief, had gone off in great haste to an airfield about Monóvar, about 20 miles from where we were, to organize a couple of planes for the government's escape.
As Negrin left Spain for the last time, chaotic shooting broke out inside Madrid. Casado's supporters fought communist units who did not know or couldn't believe that their leaders had decided not to resist the Casado coup. Once again, the Republic was tearing itself apart. For 2 weeks, Casado attempted to negotiate an honorable peace. His efforts were to prove as vain as Negrin's. Franco broke off contact with him. Casado now had no choice. He ordered the Republican armies to raise the white flag and surrender. The nationalists, in the end, never had to fight to capture Madrid. Unopposed, they walked in.
I woke up and I heard shouts, and I thought somebody's gone mad and now we're going to be in real trouble, just when the war is about to finish. And then I came out and I heard shouts, "Viva España, Viva España." And I said, "What are you shouting for? You've all gone crazy." They replied, "No, no, Madrid has been liberated. The war is over." And then we all jumped from the balcony into the street.
I took my brother with me, and we went out to see what was happening in the streets. I reckon that even some of those who'd taken part in the events of the 14th of April 1931 were now the ones who climbed onto lorries. I think they were more or less the same people. Or at least, there were just as many of them, and they were equally enthusiastic.
As Franco's soldiers trudged into the streets of Madrid, Palenque's supporters poured out of hiding. Republicans, trying to escape from nationalist vengeance, headed for the port of Alicante on the southeastern coast, chosen as the main evacuation point. On March 28th, as Madrid fell, this British ship left Alicante. On board were some 500 Republicans, mostly leading figures. Left behind were about 20,000 refugees who were swarming into the harbour area, hoping desperately for ships to rescue them. For these 3 survivors, Narciso Julián, Eduardo de Guzman, and his sister-in-law, Encarnación Bueno, what followed is an indelible memory.
Well, we were looking out towards the horizon. We could see a few lights. Some people were saying that they were our boats, that they were getting nearer.
This was the worst torture of the harbour, the torment of hope, thinking we were going to be saved, when there was no salvation possible.
I remember every single moment. Each was more terrible than the one before. Every minute that passed without the boats arriving made me believe less and less in boats, in anything. My son was saying, "You'll see, Mum, you'll see, we'll get away." But when the hours passed and no boats came near, I stopped believing in anything.
By March 30th, Italian troops had occupied the fortress overlooking the harbour. The Republicans, crowded along this quay, were at their mercy. The last boats had gone. Now there was no hope, only fear.
I was sitting there, my son next to me. We were talking. We knew already that the boats were not coming. Along came a man of about 40, strong, good-looking, a man who looked in really good health. He came quite close to me. I didn't realize what was happening. I heard a shot. He'd shot himself and fallen down right there. I totally lost my calm then. My son was saying, "Don't be frightened, Mother. Don't be scared. You'll see a lot more of this here, but don't be frightened." But of course I was scared stiff. I don't know what I thought. Perhaps that they would bring out machine guns and finish us all off.
Nationalist troops moved into Alicante to reinforce the Italians. The helpless masses in the harbour knew that they would be rounded up the following day. For the anarchists amongst them, one question remained to be settled in their last hours of liberty.
And we spent the whole night discussing what we should do from a revolutionary viewpoint, without giving ourselves any false illusions about escaping death. But what was the best thing for the cause we had all defended? Should we give ourselves up or kill ourselves? This was the last-minute dilemma, what we were debating that last night. These were the 2 points of view. Emil said, this was a comrade called Mario Emil, he said, "I'm not sparing them any crimes. If they want me dead, they'll have to kill me."
Nobody on the quayside slept that night. Through the darkness of March 31st, this macabre debate was argued to its conclusion. Many agreed with Guzman's friend to stay alive and let the enemy take the ultimate guilt. But others made suicide pacts. Eduardo de Guzman recalls the last 2 to die.
After that last discussion, when we were about to leave, they took each other by the hand and saying, "This is our last protest against fascism," they raised their pistols to each other's heads and shot each other. As we were leaving the port, somebody said, "We'll soon be envying the dead." And I thought, no, we'd better start envying them now.
Few today remember that Alicante port was the place of the Republic's last agony. Nearly 3 years after the army insurrection, the war was over. The guns fell silent. The church bells began to ring. Over the radio, a nationalist announcer delivered Franco's final war communique.
En el día de hoy, cautivo y desarmado el ejército rojo, han alcanzado las tropas nacionales sus últimos objetivos militares. La guerra ha terminado. Burgos, 1 de abril de 1939, año de la victoria. El generalísimo Franco.
April 2nd, 1939, the day after the war's official end, was Palm Sunday. In Madrid, Generalissimo Franco went to lay a sword of victory in the church of Santa Barbara. It was the first of many triumphal occasions in which Franco and Spain celebrated the nationalist victory. What would Spain be like under Franco? The fighting was over, but the so-called National Crusade had a long way to run. Spain was to be transformed, but into an image of the past. After the turmoil of the Republic, the Spain of history was to be resurrected, ruled once more by the church, the oligarchy, the great landowners. There was to be a fatherland at once new and ancient, a nation united, obedient, purged of evil. Franco decreed, retroactively, that all who had opposed the nationalists would be answerable. Even pre-war political opponents were not to be spared. He saw the main threat in the working class, once triumphant, now prostrate. Here, the purge must be most harsh. It began at once, among the new hordes of his captives. Nobody suspected of Republican sympathies was safe. Concentration camps all over Spain were swamped by hundreds of thousands of prisoners. The captives from the harbour at Alicante were brought here, to this barren place, which was then the concentration camp of Albatera. It is said that Franco personally ordered that there should be no photographs of the camp. When it had served its purpose, every trace of it was cleared away. All that remains today is an old hut used by the guards and a path once trodden by 30,000 arriving prisoners. But the camp can never be clear from the memories of those who survived Albatera.
The repression began right from the start. We were never considered human beings. That's the way it was under Franco. We were always considered as things, never as human beings.
Albatera was not just an internment camp. It was also a camp where people awaited selection for execution. Through the gate which used to stand here, the visitors arrived. These were the moments of terror, for these visitors were members of the Falange, who came to identify their enemies.
They were looking for people from their towns, or anyone else of note, anyone who'd been a volunteer or fought in the Republican Army, or anyone who'd been mayor or any other official in any Republican town in Spain. And they picked these people out right there and then. This one, this one, this one. And without more ado, just took them off. They took them away to their respective villages. Most of the time, these prisoners never reached their destination. What usually happened was that we heard the shots from here, and that was the end of them.
There were also executions within the camp. The prisoners were forced to watch them.
I remember the first executions. I'd been locked up in the punishment area. There were 3 lads they shot. They'd lined us up at machine gun point. One of the lads, a commissar, said to everyone, "Keep calm, comrades, don't make a move. They'll use it as an excuse to kill us all." And they shot him right there in front of us.
Nobody knows how many of the 30,000 who went into Albatera perished by execution or just callous neglect.
Most people know what the Nazi extermination camps were like. They've seen films of them. I think that the Albatera camp was in many ways like those extermination camps, except it was less systematic. Everything here was less organized.
In the concentration camps, persecution was still haphazard, but soon the policy of systematic repression began. The prison population increased by over 200,000 people. There were token trials, rapid sentences, executions. The terror lasted at this pitch for more than 4 years, longer than the war itself. Many, like Narciso Julián and Eduardo de Guzman, suffered for much longer. Both were sentenced to death. Eduardo de Guzman spent 9 years in prison. He and Narciso Julián, like many others, waited to be executed for over a year, never knowing if the next day was to be their last. Narciso Julián was to spend 25 years in prison. This part of the prison yard, the Yezerías, still holds special memories for him. In 1945, he met his daughter there. In 1965, 20 years later, he met his granddaughter in the same spot. But for nationalist families, the suppression of all dissent meant unity. Tomás Garicano Goñi, later one of Franco's ministers, found a solid logic in Franco's persecutions.
The repression was aimed at preventing any possible reaction from any communists or socialists still at liberty in Spain or living abroad in exile, in case they returned to Spain, to turn the situation on its heels and take power again.
As the corpse of José Antonio Primo de Rivera was carried from Alicante to Madrid, Republican supporters in villages along the road were shot without even the hearing the 15th century Inquisition had given its victims. Franco was hammering Spain into a political monolith without opposition. The Falange, which had stood for a revolutionary fascism, had already been forcibly integrated into an ultra-conservative one-party state. But the dead José Antonio, the charismatic leader of the Falange executed by the Republicans, was now appointed patron saint and martyr of the new Spain. Francisco Franco, El Caudillo, could safely share the leadership of Spain with a dead man who could not contradict the myth imposed on him. All other political movements were forbidden. Regional autonomy and diversity were obliterated. Such was Franco's version of national unity, and many in the Spanish middle class greeted it with rapture.
Las procesiones en aquellos momentos tenían un auge fenomenal.
There was an extraordinary boom in processions, Holy Week processions, and processions for just about every saint. They were packed with people marching along. There was a revival of all this sort of thing that had disappeared under the Republic. These things seemed important to us then. They gave us the impression of recovering something that we had lost.
Los valores religiosos, los valores patrióticos.
The religious values, patriotic values, the values of order, all these were restored.
Pero lógicamente los que teníamos una vida.
There was an absence of freedom, but logically, those of us that had well-ordered lives, those of us who were professionals and saw things from the personal viewpoint only, we felt very much at ease and happy.
In this ruined Spain, the first years of peace were even harder in their way than the war. The country lost hundreds of thousands of refugees who were forced to remain in exile. And in Spain, to the physical destruction were added famine, mass unemployment, impoverishment. Many thousands died of starvation. Thousands more were shot. For there was no magnanimity in Franco, no gift of reconciliation. And nationalists everywhere at every level became infected with their leaders' lust for revenge. What happened in masterless matters happened throughout Spain. The Moliner family had worked this plot of land for many years. Juan Moliner was a young man in 1938. He and his family were socialists. When the nationalists swept into Aragon, they had fled with other refugees towards Valencia.
And when the war finished, Franco said we shouldn't be afraid to return to our villages. And of course, since we weren't guilty of anything, we came back. When we arrived here, they arrested us. They wouldn't even let us out of jail.
Moliner's father was imprisoned by the local Falange, who now control masterless matters. Juan was never to see his father again. 40 years later, the memory of his death still pains him.
Of course I remember. Those were very critical moments, crucial moments. I wouldn't wish that on anyone. And on top of it all, one has to live with those people knowing that they had killed him. But you had to go on living with them without saying a word.
After every civil war, hatred is the real survivor, stifled behind closed doors, hidden in neighbors who avert their faces on the village street. The poison trickles down the years. So it was in Spain, where almost every family had a hatred to nurse. And yet, as time passed, locked minds began timidly to open again.
As my children grew up, they used to chide me because I'd been a Franco supporter. Mum, how on earth could you support Franco? I think that he saved us. How can you say that? Then they began bringing me books and books and more books, and I started to realize that it had been terrible, that there had been as many monstrosities on this side as there'd been on the other side, because I already knew about the other side. But I didn't know what had happened here. And so, gradually you evolve, and you realize that there is neither good nor evil, as they used to tell you, that you can think for yourself, that something you do not like, someone else may think is fine, that you are in no position to judge others, that someone can think one way while you think another, and he could be just as good a person as you. That is what my children taught me.